Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 4. We're going to finish the OLG model today, and we're going to start talking about a more general setup, more general in the sense that maybe people have longer planning horizons than just 2 years or 2 periods. That was the underlying assumption of the OLG model, which is extremely useful. So my purpose today is to introduce the applications of the OLG setup. I'll review briefly what we did last time. We'll review the decentralized market outcome, and then we'll talk about a centralized planner's outlook. So if one could theoretically do this any way one wanted, subject to the resource constraints, what would one do? And how does that compare with the market outcome? That's the so-called social planner's comparison. It's a benchmark, and therefore we can talk more reasonably, or even more specifically, concretely about the idea of dynamic efficiency. Is it possible for an economy to invest too much or too little relative to such a notion as a central planner's optimum? And again, we're not endorsing the central planner. We're just saying this is where we want to go if we can, and we should strive maybe as a politician or as a policymaker to do that if we can recognize that we're doing something wrong. And you can use this model to think about a lot of interesting questions that plague modern societies, like pensions, the national debt. There's a lot of confusion about what the national debt is. Who do we owe it to, and does it matter? Intergenerational altruism, including the issue of CO2 emissions and future generations. So this is a really great framework, and it's been used for the past 60, 70 years to think about these things. And it's extendable. So remember I told you models should be modified if they need to be modified, and they must be susceptible to modification. So we'd like to add on aspects that help us understand reality better. So maybe it's better to have 4 generations. Maybe it's better to have 30 generations of overlapping individuals. And you can do that. You need a computer. You can't do it with pencil and paper. So the reason we do this and have a diagram is to help us get our mind around these conflicts between old and young, between the born and alive and the not yet born, and all subject to this common issue of the resource constraint. So we're all subject to a resource constraint. That's what economists understand better than anybody else in this world. We're subject to a certain fixed amount of stuff we can pass around or put into the future, and we have to deal with that. A lot of people would promise you something that it cannot be realized, then we should be able to recognize that. Okay? Subject to the budget constraint, subject to the resource constraint. I mean, economikos comes from the Greek word for household or budget, right? So it's all about maintaining a budget. It's not necessarily about taste or game theory or markets. It's about how do we manage our resources. That's what Paul Samuelson said in the 1930s when he wrote his thesis. Okay, so thinking about 2-period-lived individuals and then maybe extending that to a problem where we have lots of individuals who are born in the future, and how do they think about themselves or their children? Maybe we have connections. Maybe we're not all separated. Maybe you can actually think of dynasties. You plan for your children, maybe not even born yet, or your children's children, and you just have this notion, I want them to be as well off as I am. Okay, and then there's a brilliant economist in the 1920s by the name of Frank Ramsey who actually came up with this idea that we should not be so selfish and think only about ourselves. Maybe we should think in the very long run. And this is a notion that's, right now we're having this COP27 conference. We're talking about exactly these issues. I mean, to what extent should we really start thinking about unborn generations in our planning and spending to avert climate change? Okay, so last week we looked at the basics of the OLG model. We have preferences. We had these 2 periods of life, young and old, and you have a simple utility function that you've seen in microeconomics. Technology is the way we move resources across time, meaning we produce goods that we can put into the capital stock to make production in the future possible. and we have a market form, decentralized trading, market prices determine our behavior. The model's really easy. I mean, you can, if you like economics, like macro, you can do many more things with this. You can have labor supply being endogenous. You can have several periods. You can have choices of different technologies, et cetera. The most important thing is we were able to think about the notion of an optimum as being separate from a market outcome. So we're not ideologues here. We don't really naturally want to believe all the time that the market gives us the best solution. We have to prove it. We want to show it. And that's the point of doing this analysis. Today we're going to talk about the golden rule in detail. Okay, it's sort of, if the social planner could call the shots for everybody, in other words, not you get to choose how much to save, but I'm going to tell you how much to save, but I have your interests in mind. I'm not a malevolent dictator, I'm a benevolent dictator, right? I'm a good-natured social planner. Okay, so we had, just to remind you, this is a very, very powerful model. And the fact that it's been around so long, it's a little bit like certain models in chemistry and physics. You know, we have this notion of a nucleus of an atom and some electrons that are around it. You used to think they were like little orbits, and now we think there's more like a probability distribution. And they're just different models of thinking about it, but it's the same object, same basic idea. So this is why the OLG model is so popular. And you know, the social planner is this individual that has your best interests in mind, knows your utility function, knows the production function. And so this is the benchmark we want to care about. And we have to worry about this notion of discounting. I'm going to talk about it in detail in a few seconds. So how do we treat people's utility in the future, and in this case, people who have not yet been born yet? Clearly, if you're acting for yourself, for your own little family, or your own your own perspective of two periods, it's not going to be the same as people who have not yet been born. You're not going to consider them at all in your choice. So that's the social discount rate. The social planner has a weighting of future welfare and utility of future generations that are unborn that is different from your personal, private, possibly selfish. Okay, so you might say that the perspective. So you might say that the social planner has solidarity. So if you think that some societies are more solidarity-oriented than others, this is the way to think about this. So I want to write down the objective function that the social planner wants to maximize. And again, using mathematics, we can formulate that very clearly. There's no debate about that, right? That's the great thing about math is you can discuss the assumptions, but you can't discuss the math. The math is clear. And then we're going to write down the maximization problem, and the first order necessary conditions, it's like macro lingo is FONC, the first order necessary conditions to characterize the social planner's best policy. That's my strategy today. And then when I do that, I can discuss dynamic inefficiency very explicitly. When the social planner does it better than the market, when the market gets it right. Okay? So here was the math problem I wrote down before. Basically, the social planner has capital T periods over which she is trying to make everyone best off as possible. Now, how do you compare welfare? That's another loaded question. I'm assuming that we can. Okay, so it's an assumption, but you might say, well, I'm not happy enough. Make me happier. Give me more food. Give me more cars. Give me blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we're not going to let you do that. Social planner knows what your tastes are, and you look like everybody else. Again, just the abstraction to help us get through this problem. So that's the notion of utility when old, utility when young. Each generation lives 2 periods, and the subscripts are clear. So in a current period, you have in period T, you have C1 consumption by the young at that period, and C2 is the consumption of the old in that period. So for any given person, that person's utility is given by an item or an entry in that sum of over T periods, the utility of your current utility, of your current consumption in period T, plus the discounted utility of your consumption in period T plus 1 when you're old. And then you let little t run from 0 to capital T minus 1. So we have capital T generations of people's utility. I throw that into a pot, and I'm going to ask, how can I make that as big as possible? Given that I, central planner, am not God, I have to actually also obey this resource constraint Every period, there's enough resources to hand out to the young and to the old who are alive then. I can't put it in the refrigerator. The only refrigerator I have is to invest it in the capital stock, which allows me to produce in the next period. That's not a refrigerator, that's a factory, right? It's a machine. Okay, so on the left-hand side, I have uses, and on the right-hand side, I have sources. The sources on the right-hand side are the not yet depreciated capital stock, and then my production with the given capital stock. So capital stock today, I can't just, it's not manna from heaven. I can't just sort of conjure it up. I have to have saved it from previous periods. So that's the law of life. So you can see KT plus 1 on the left-hand side can be isolated, and basically what I have in the next period as productive capital is a function of many things. How much I consumed for the young people, how much the young people consumed, how much the old people consumed, taking account for the fact that the people who are younger are bigger in number than the people who were in the previous generation, right? Because people are growing at rate 1, at gross rate 1 plus n, at rate of n per period. Okay, and then you have this initial condition. So the social planner cannot conjure up capital out of nowhere, and the social planner also starts with a capital stock. So after World War II, Germany started with what was left after World War II, and Great Britain, after World War II, started with what Britain had. Those were different per capita, okay? And that was what you started with, and you can sort of grow it or you can shrink it. And then possibly there's a period of the end of the world, which is the last generation, capital T. This is just for tractability. When you get into infinite time, as we will later, it gets a little bit fuzzier, but right now it's really important for you to understand the logic. So the central planner at the end of time has to basically make the capital stock steer into some value, K upper bar. It's the terminal condition. It could also be 0. You could say, well, let's just eat it all up on the last day. You could do that too. In this model, you can. You can eat the capital, right? Or you can, but it's not for the social planner to choose on her own. She has to accept what her constraint is. So she starts with a capital stock and has to end with a capital stock. What's the best way of managing this economy over the next capital T generations? That's the social planner's problem in the most basic form. Okay? Now just before I get to you, the social planner also monitors and weights the welfare of each generation. So this XI is an arbitrary weight. And later we'll put a discount factor in there because the right way to do this is to have a discount rate. But I want to make it general for you to understand that basically the social planner could actually have a preference for the 30th generation or the 29th generation or the second generation, or might have some arbitrary weights that we don't understand. But given those, the central planner has this job. She has the job of making the thing as big as possible. You got a question?
Yeah, so when they assume that in the end, like this ends, why would there be reason to have capital stock left?
Right, great question. Either you eat it all, then you'd really want to use it, but maybe you have some constraint, just for generality, you might want to give it to the next social planner. So if you think of these as governments, again, this is just a general specification. I mean, I would personally say, yeah, you're right, let's just eat it all up, because who cares about the next social planner? But maybe she has to pass on the baton to the next planner, okay? Any other questions about that? So this XI, this is an arbitrary weight. I'm just going to make it discounting. So the social planner will discount like we all do in economics. You weigh the future, or weight the future less than you weight the present. And you might do it at a lower rate. You might do it at a very, very low rate. That'll be Ramsey's message. Maybe you should do it at 0. And you can do that because this is a defined horizon. Capital T is not infinite. If you do infinity, it gets nasty. It's not defined. Okay? So I'll call this theta. This is the social planner's impatience. And the social planner's impatience, positive, means the social planner cares less about the future generations than the current generations. And it's always 1 over 1 plus theta to some power. So 2 power squared means the 2 generations I weight, that second generation after mine, or after the current one, at 1 plus 1 plus theta inverse squared less. Okay, and that would have a declining weight, just like we do in finance. It's declining, but it's utility. We're discounting the utility, the happiness of, or the welfare of the future generations. Obviously, the less impatient the social planner is, the smaller theta is going to be. Okay, then when it's equal to 0, it's equal treatment for all generations. However, these generations are getting bigger, so if we care about people instead of generations, we actually want to use a negative discount rate. Because in 50 years, there'll be a lot more people in this world, and we have to care about them all equally, right? And that's another extension of this. We'll generally think about generations. So Generation X, Generation Z, Generation Y are treated in a discounted way that's consistent. The great thing about discounting is it's time consistent. If I have a weight today and I go into the next period, the square of that weight becomes the weight raised to the first power, and it's consistent. I don't change my mind. I'm not being inconsistent with myself, but with my inner self. Okay, and if you like that stuff, take some behavioral economics, because there's a lot of reasons to doubt that's always a good way of doing things. But in any case, it's interesting. Okay, so we have this wonderful setup. Now, let's solve this problem. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We have to use math, calculus. But again, think of it as a huge mountain, you know, in many, many dimensions. I want to make this mountain, I want to reach the top of that mountain. And to reach the top of the mountain, it must be the case that no matter how I change my plan, I can't get any higher. Right? That's what a mountain is. And the constraint is like saying I can go as high on this mountain as I want, but I have to be below some plane or some set of points on that mountain that cannot be exceeded because of the resource constraint. So that's what constrained maximization means. And as you remember from calculus, the first derivative of a function is like the slope. So when I make that slope close to 0, I've really gotten to the top of a local mountain. Maybe not the ultimate top, but at least a local hill, I'm at the top. So that will be a first order necessary characterization of being at the top. Okay? To make this easier, I still refrain from using the Lagrange approach, so I'm just going to substitute using the handy-dandy budget constraint, which is true in every period. It's a sequence of budget constraints. I will substitute those into the problem, and then I'll take the derivative with respect to two variables. Current consumption of the currently young. Again, that's a bunch of, every generation has a currently young, and the capital stock in the subsequent period that's implied by their savings behavior, and that already implies the consumption of that generation when they're of the currently old generation. So in other words, it's like a sharing problem. If I let the young people today eat more, the older people have to eat less today, or we have less investment today for tomorrow, because today's investment is tomorrow's capital stock. Okay? So here, when you do the math, and Leopold will do this in detail, but you can do it yourself, you get two sequences of first order conditions. For every period t, you get two first order conditions. And they're really interesting in sense of their interpretation. Okay, and look at the first one. The first one says, the marginal utility of consumption today by the currently young is related somehow to the marginal utility of the currently old. Okay? And the second first order condition relates the same object, the marginal utility of the currently young, to the marginal utility of that currently young generation when they are older. So there are two different linkages. One is an intratemporal link. It's like comparing you to your grandmother, and the other one is comparing you to when you're a grandfather or a grandmother. Okay, so that's the logic of these. Again, this is the social planner. She's acting in our interest. She's doing the best she can to make us as happy as possible. And those two sequences of first order conditions, why sequence? Because every t, it's true from t equals 0 to t equals big T minus 1. Okay, so we have a lot of first order conditions. I would never dream of asking you to solve them, but characterization is easy, and it gives us the economic intuition. Intratemporal utility maximization for optimization condition, for first order condition, and we have a first order condition for intertemporal. And if you think about it, if I can link you with your grandmother and you with your the grandmother who's still alive with you right now, I've pretty much linked everybody, right? The only people I haven't linked are the currently old. They have their own special, because when you start this optimization, there are some people who are old right now, and they have no predecessors in this problem. They don't have any sort of analog to compare with, so they're kind of like a freebie. So we have intra and intergenerational efficiency, and these weights are simply the number of people in each generation and the impatience of the central planner. Okay, and what else? There's one more discount rate or factor that's evident there. Which one is it in those conditions? Yeah. Right. So within a family, there's impatience, and the social planner is so nice that she actually wants to recognize that. So she's actually going to say, well, this family is impatient, beta's low, so I'm going to help this family along, I'm going to make this family happy. But she's got the big picture in mind. She's not just maximizing that family's utility, she's thinking about the family's utility relative to all the other families that are existing currently and in the future. And they're all connected because of the capital stock. So if a family doesn't invest much today in the private economy, there won't be much capital to give on to the next generation in the market in the subsequent periods. So that's the whole reason the social planner could do better than the decentralized outcome. Right? So this is really I've always just stared at this, and Leopold is extremely fascinated by this because you can use this to justify the existence of money, not just capital. Diamond used this to think about capital and optimal capital investment, but you can also use the thing about the existence of money, because if I can give you $1 and you say, who's this guy, George Washington? Why should I take this? That's one equilibrium. You turn it down. The others, you say, thank you very much, I'll take it, because I know the next generation of people out there who are selling goods will accept my dollar. Right? That's the good equilibrium, monetary equilibrium. We're not going to do that here, but you can, and Samuelson's first paper was about that. In 1958, he talked about the implementation of this using fiat money based on beliefs. Okay, you could use seashells, Bitcoin, whatever. As long as people accept it, then it's a vehicle for transmitting consumption from my personal perspective into the future, even though I can't eat the money. Capital I can eat. So this is a more robust model. This is not subject to the claim it's just a Ponzi scheme, right? Okay, so if you want, you can play with these first-order conditions. You take the first one and shift it by one period. This is a world of certainty, again, with all those caveats. And then you can substitute it in the second, and you can simplify it, and you get exactly the first-order condition for the private family. And this kind of goes with what you said. The beta is important because the social planner, she's interested in the welfare of all the people born and unborn, and she's going to recognize that people have different levels of impatience. Here they're all the same, but its beta is less than 1, so you are a little bit impatient. So the first-order conditions can be manipulated to replicate the first-order condition for the family in a decentralized way. Okay? But that does not exclude that the economy as an aggregate makes a big mistake. Okay, so it's the fallacy of composition to say that, well, I did it right. Maybe the economy has to do it right. That's not true. Okay, so that's what the social planner exercise shows us. And I've set, to make this easy, I've set A equals 0, the rate of technical progress, just to make it easy. But it all goes through with a positive rate of technical progress that's exogenous. So we can help, and I'll show you that later. Okay? Now, the social planner is also choosing the aggregate capital stock, and nobody in the private equilibrium necessarily gets to do that. You can choose your own private capital stock that you want to acquire and then spend when you're old, but it doesn't guarantee that it's in the social interest of everyone alive and unborn to do that. You might want to do more, you might want to do less. If you want to do more, you're probably dynamically efficient. If you want to do less, that means you're dynamically inefficient. You've saved too much as an aggregate, okay, and you could increase everyone's welfare for nothing. It's a free lunch. Okay, and to show that, we have this famous analog to the golden rule. It's called the turnpike theorem. It's basically a way of of looking what the social planner does with respect to K. So if you go back and look at the first order conditions, the social planner will choose KT to make sure that the marginal product of capital after depreciation is close to the rate of growth of the population plus the impatience of herself, her own self social planner rate of discount, okay? And again, I have to show the picture, and I'll come back. The picture is kind of suggestive. So no matter where we start, we want to get close to this golden rule level of capital, and then at the end of time, when we either eat it or give it to somebody else, it has to add up. So you see what that red curve means, that starting at 0 at some arbitrary K0, which I have to inherit, I have to start with, I'm going to go as fast as possible. That's why it's called the turnpike, because it looks like a highway. You want to get on the highway, and then you stay on that highway until it's over. And then I get off the highway at the exit where I want to get off. Okay? And when you're close to that highway at the top, along that straight path, you're basically going to have the condition that the marginal product of the level of capital stock per capita is about equal to the rate of discount of the social planner plus the population growth rate plus the depreciation rate. So that's really when an economy does the best it can. The implied productivity of capital will be determined by these exogenous things. If we're below that, that means we've probably invested too much. Our economy as a whole is saving too much. We're building too many machine tools, too many buildings, investing in too many trucks, and not enough in cars and computers that we can use for fun instead of for work. Okay, that's the idea, right? That would imply K too high or K too low would be we're not investing enough. So going back to my point, if the social planner is completely patient in the sense that she treats all generations equally, then it looks like Phelps. Remember, Phelps said, set the marginal product of capital per capita equals to the growth rate of the population, and if you have technical progress, and if you have depreciation, you add those in as well. So this is kind of you can think this is a micro foundation of Phelps, if you remember Phelps from two sessions ago. Okay, maximizing per capita consumption. But that's a very specific problem. This is maximizing per capita utility, or weighted utility, weighting using the social planner's preferences. Okay, I know this is all very dense, but it's pretty interesting because it implies that economies, if left to their own devices, may do something that's not quite right. And I don't want to say that's always the case. We need to benchmark it, and that's what we're going to do now. Remember, if the social planner is impatient, the social planner will use a little bit less capital, because that means the marginal product of capital will be higher, and therefore the condition that I just wrote down about the top will be met, right? Because the marginal product of capital is increasing, it's decreasing in capital per capita. So if you invest too much, you're going to have inefficient capital, less productive at the margin than it should be. Okay, this is a great picture. Again, you can derive it, you can program a computer to plot it for you, but we're not going to do that. It is the implication of all those first order conditions strung together, constraining the planner to start with K0 and to end with K cap T. Okay, it's a beautiful problem. It also tells us that now we have a benchmark. Does our social planner do better than the decentralized market outcome? Remember, the decentralized market outcome is you are born, you work in the first period, you save, and you consume what you saved in the second period. No bequests, no gifts to other people. It's all selfish. Maybe you have, we'll introduce that when we talk about Ramsey. Maybe you have concerns about bequests. But right now, everyone's kind of focused on their own thing. And, that's a set of first order conditions that are kind of met by the social planner. But the social planner doesn't have prices. The social planner commands the optimum. And a decentralized market equilibrium has prices. The price is, a la microeconomics, is the vector of prices or numbers that will make us happy with our spending and our earning and our working behavior. And in this simple model, it's the wage and the rate of return on capital, or the interest rate. So we can solve for those. And it would be basically the market clearing condition that we wrote down last time. That's going to give us the interest rate and the wage, intersected with the factor price frontier. That's the market equilibrium. And the question is, does that look anything like social planners' nirvana? You know, she's doing a great job for us. That's what we're doing. Do we match up? Well, you can massage that a little bit and get a nice interpretation. This is something we'll do in macro. You'll do in other courses as well. The marginal rate of substitution of consumption tomorrow for consumption today is kind of hooked up with the economic rate of transformation using the capital stock in this production function, okay? Net of depreciation. That's exactly what the private agents do. But it's not the same, because we can all be doing our thing individually, but because we're not thinking about the big picture, our connected market outcome will be possibly suboptimal. Okay? And you can show that. I'm going to try to show that in a very intuitive way, because in the steady state, with no growth in technology, this is an easy case, you can see that everything will be kind of determined by the savings behavior of the family. If you compare that to the planner, we already said, there's no reason those two will coincide with each other. And you can show that thinking about the savings behavior, because you can, in fact, in the problem set, you'll probably take an example like this with Cobb-Douglas production and log utility, very simple, just a simple derivative, and you can solve for it analytically. You can actually get a closed form savings function, a savings rate, and all the rest. Okay? There's no evidence at all that the world behaves like, or that there's no reason to believe that this model will generate a result that coincides with that outcome. Okay? So you can have two different possibilities. You can have dynamic efficiency. So in that case, there would be not enough capital. The interest rate is too high because people don't save enough. And it would be possible to make future generations better off in the social planner sense, but the current generations would have to sacrifice. And I think about the Ukraine right now, right? If the war ended right now, there's a lot of reconstruction to do. Who's going to pay for it? What would the social planner do? Well, according to the Turnpike theorem, the social planner would make the current if Ukraine could not get help from anybody, the current generation of Ukrainians would suffer a lot to rebuild the country, and then they would reach their presumably best solution for the others. Because the social planner cares about those current generations, but they're going to have to work hard. And if you put in disutility of labor, it gets even less attractive. Still, somebody's got to pay for it. So maybe that explains why the regions of the world are thinking about forking over some money, because we know it's going to be miserable. It was like Germany after World War II, or Japan after World War II, or the United States after the Civil War. It's not nice. Very low consumption per capita. Okay? So that's the case of dynamic efficiency. You're asking the current generation to do a lot. Okay, so it's not really reasonable to expect them to sacrifice for future generations. But you could have a situation where you have inefficiency, where you're on a bad path, you're saving so much, you've got all this housing stock that nobody wants to live in. Think of London. If you've been to London, there's some really nice places there that no one is living in because they're used as objects of intergenerational wealth transfer by certain individuals. Ask yourself as a social planner, is that a good idea? Maybe there's too much housing capital. It's just a thought of mine, okay? If that's the case, maybe we can do better. Maybe we can consume that housing capital by putting people into those houses and move to a higher level of utility for everybody. That would be dynamic inefficiency. Okay? Reducing savings and investment today. Okay, so that's the lesson you should learn. You know, in the case of A equals 0, you can actually show this. We've already done this with our curves, our wonderful factor price frontier and general goods market equilibrium intersection. We'll do that again in a second for policy. But Just remember, it's not equivalent. Really important to remember that. Just put up there for... We already have a theory of the interest rate. Okay, so now it really gets interesting because the social planner is doing the best she can, and we know the marginal product, less depreciation is the real interest rate. So maybe we have a theory of where the interest rate would be in the optimal case, or maybe in the suboptimal case, the market case. Maybe there's too much savings, too much capital. People talk about the savings glut, okay, because everyone's scared of living too long, or maybe there are other sorts of reasons. Maybe technological progress is slowing down too much. There's not enough to invest in, so there's no rate of return anymore. Okay, these are all alternative explanations. A lot of people say it's because of China and India. These countries have become very wealthy very quickly. They have lots of income. What are they going to do with it? Well, they can buy up the United States. They can invest in their own country, but maybe the set of projects is less and less attractive the more they invest. Okay, so we have a theory of the interest rate. Somebody had their hand up. Yeah.
This theory or the model with the equation, does that take into account investment or capital or savings from abroad? Like, is this
No, this is a closed economy. This is like taking the world as one big apple, and then or putting walls around a country and saying, do it on your own. Obviously, if you have open borders, you have lots of overlapping generation systems interacting with each other, so the ones that are saving a lot could actually buy up capital in the other country. So that's kind of what I was alluding to in the case of London. But that's just to inspire people to think about this in a different way. Okay? We know what the golden rule is, at least along the turnpike. It's close to theta plus n. So this is kind of a surprising result, right? The social planner, if the social planner cares the way we've talked about it, it's going to be related to impatience of the social planner, population growth. Okay? And if the social planner is really, really patient, doesn't favor generations too much in the present, then it'll basically choose the interest rate equals population rate. Now, when you have technological progress, it pushes out things a little bit, so there's a little bit of pressure on the interest rate. So this would imply that for general theta and values of A, you'd have this extended version of the golden rule, but it's the same outcome, something to remember. So this is kind of a theory of the interest rate. If you think that the interest rate, the golden rule, marginal product of capital is that one, then that's an upper bound on what the interest rate should be. If we're screwing up, it's going to be less than that, right? It's going to be, if we're investing too much, or if we're too impatient, it'll be higher than that, but it's going to be kind of a benchmark. So it's the sum of impatience of the central planner. The central planner is going to, have some impatience, and then you have population growth. So one explanation for the fall of interest rates in the past 20, 30 years is a decline in technical progress, the rate of growth of technical progress, or a decline in the population rate. So one reason Japan has a problem possibly with generating a positive rate of interest on capital is just that there aren't that many people there anymore. I mean, they're kind of shrinking. They're not letting people in from abroad. Some people fear the same things will be true in Germany and Italy. Seems to be the case already. Okay. In the private solution, we have a comparable situation. So, using that as a benchmark, you can think of the private outcome would have a similar, but not necessarily identical outcome. So to find out what the real interest rate is in this case, you need to know what the production function is. So that's why I said in the problem set, you'll be given a Cobb-Douglas production function and utility function. And the savings function you have to derive. That's how much do I save today out of my personal private income to eat when I'm old and gray. Okay? So we have a great theory. Too much savings, not enough investment opportunities, declining population growth, and maybe opening up to countries that have not saved before, like China is just gangbusters. They're growing like crazy, right? Until recently, until COVID, they had 10% growth per year. When you grow like that, what are you going to do with all your GDP? I mean, you can try to build airports every day, but you kind of run out of space. So you start buying up Piraeus and Hamburg, right? You start doing other stuff because you need I mean, just a rational saver would do that. Try to transmit your consumption into the future. Okay, so I think I've inspired you. I see you're all awake still. You're not reading the newspaper. When I first started Humboldt, two things happened. When I knew I was doing a bad job is when the male students would open up the newspaper and read the sports, and the female students would start knitting. They would pull out their yarn and start knitting in my class, right? So that doesn't happen anymore because the gender roles have changed. Now the men are knitting and the women are reading the sports page. But now you're all paying attention. So now I'm going to give you some interesting stuff. I'm going to talk about policy. What can we do with this thing? I already told you we can look at interest rates. That helps a little bit, but we can do better than that. We can look at Social Security and pensions. We can look at asset bubbles. We can look at technological change. We already did that. Labor taxation, I'm not going to do that. We can look at taxing capital. Because you can see these affect the incentives to save and invest relative to just consume. And of course, altruism. How do we care about the future generations that are yet unborn? Do we care? I think we do care. I'll tell you why in a second. And of course, you can use this to look at climate change. So some of the innovative research in this area in economic theory is to think about climate change, diversity. You can even think about diversity using this model. How many new species do we have in the future relative to today? It's like a stock of capital, right? You don't want to, if you drive too many species to extinction because you eat them or you kill them, then there may be a future loss to future generations because the Germans call it Artenvielfalt. The diversity actually generates new species, new ideas, new resilience, right? Okay, yeah, you get it. Okay, so let's talk about pensions. There are two ways of thinking about this, right? There are two extremes, and the real world is somewhere in between. The first extreme is what? What does a pension system do? Is anybody from Norway here? Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands? What? Yeah, the government, well, runs it. The government's going to run it in both cases, but the government funds it. So the government actually takes your payment, and it actually takes it and buys assets with it. It goes to the market and buys Swedish or Danish or Norwegian American bonds and puts it away and collects the income and increases it, reinvests it, and then when you retire, you get it back. Okay? That's the way the TRA-CRIF system works for professors in the United States. It's a fully funded system. What you pay in is what you get out. Okay? Very few countries do that. Norway does that. And Sweden claims to do that. If you invest in your own debt, the question is, are you really investing in anything? Because you're investing in a promise you have to pay anyway, so it's like one hand washing the other. But it's still okay. It's one way of doing it, right? You can do it in many ways. But the point is, you actually do something with the money and you get a return for it. So that would be this case. Here, just presume the government actually does the right thing and is honest, there's no wastage, just takes the money and buys an existing building like that one over there and holds it, takes the yield, and reinvests it, and you get the proceeds at the end. So it just does what you should have done, but maybe because you're stupid or irrational, you didn't do it. Okay, so you might say that's just paternalism. Burda, stop that. Okay, but that's the way the system could work. That's one extreme. Under that case, the government would take tau from you and invest tau in the market, and then give you back 1 plus r t plus 1 times tau in the next period. So the government could try to tweak tau. Tau is the tax of your income when young that's taken from you without asking you any questions. It just takes it away. So that's like American Social Security, except this one actually invests in an asset. The American system worked like that up until the 1950s, allegedly. When you have a budget constraint, sometimes you can fudge it, okay? But let's just pretend this government is doing the right thing. Okay, so the equilibrium looks like this. If you stare at this long enough, you'll understand that it doesn't change anything. Because the government does what the households would have done anyway. And if the households don't like what the government's doing, And the household will adjust its savings so that the net savings of the economy, from the household's perspective, from its personal budget constraint, is giving exactly what it would have done anyway. Okay, so you might say that's great because some people are dumb, they don't get it, or they're impatient. Well, if they're impatient, maybe we shouldn't be using this model, but if they have problems with tying their hands to the mast and they spend the money, this might be a good system, okay? But the point is, it doesn't change what would have happened if the people had done the right thing in the first place. Okay? The governments are often inefficient, so it may not be the right thing anyway, because if the government has a little bit of wastage, maybe there's some corruption, maybe there are fees paid to the bankers who manage the funds, et cetera. You might be concerned about that, right? You might be. Okay. We can use our picture to look at that. And this is a great picture because nothing changes. Right? You've taken from one pocket and you've put it into the other pocket because the private agent would have done it anyway, unless you take everything, more than everything, or you make the persons into slaves or something. We're not going to do that. These are for small changes. It's easy to show. The budget constraint for the individual household hasn't changed. So the household is just as happy as it would have been had it been doing things optimally before. Okay? Now, obviously, this would be a dumb thing to talk about unless there's a contrast, which is the other system, which is what we call pay-go, pay as you go. And this is when the government takes my money when I'm young and literally doesn't invest it. It gives it to old people who are alive in period T. Okay, so this is kind of what the social planner does, but the social planner doesn't have any prices or taxes or anything, it just does it. Okay, but here the government might do it right or wrong, we don't know. And this is the case in the United States, in Germany, most advanced countries. I think the Netherlands has moved more towards a funded system. The real world is somewhere in between, right? It's never really completely extremely one or the other, unless you live in Norway, where they have so much money. They're just rolling in the dough because of the oil fund they have. The Germans call this a Generationsvertrag. So if you're taking German, Generation, Vertrag. Contract between generations. It's an old idea, goes back to some old German Catholic priest who thought about this real hard. And he said, well, actually his Generationsvertrag was in young people working today, old people who are retired, and young people in school, and their school should also be paid for by the middle-aged, middle class. Okay, it's an idea. Here we just have two generations, but it's pretty cool, right? The idea makes sense, but people say, this is crazy. I mean, you're taking my money and you're giving it to the old people. What about me? What happens when I get old? Well, there must be some logic in it because there must hopefully be enough people when you're old to pay your pension. So it is kind of a Ponzi scheme. It's a bet that population growth will continue into the future, that productivity growth will continue into the future to feed the system in the older, and when you're old, when the system has gotten older. Okay, everybody get that? And we can use the same model to think about that. The first order conditions for the household now involve taking your money away from you, okay, and you're not going to get it back. You're going to get something else back, but it's not related to your investment. So a lot of people in the U.S. talk about investment in Social Security. What does it yield? That yield can be calculated. You take all the money you've put into the system and then calculate all the money that came out of the system. Is the rate of return negative, positive, adjusting for inflation? Right? Sometimes it looks pretty good. Sometimes it looks really good. When interest rates are low and the stock market's not doing so well, maybe it's a good idea to put money in Social Security. But if population growth is slowing down in an unexpected way, then maybe it's not such a great investment. Okay, the first order condition is still equating, for the private household, equating marginal utility today to the marginal utility when old, incorporating the fact that the rate of return is what it is, but I've lost some, I'm not getting back exactly what I got in the old system when I was investing for myself. I'm getting BT plus 1. So the question is, what is the relationship between BT plus 1 and my initial payment into the system? Okay. It turns out that unequivocally, in this case, the capital stock will be lower because I'm kind of banking on getting this BT plus 1. And you can show that the blue curve isn't affected. Blue curve is the factor price frontier, the trade-off between rates of return on capital and the wage. But given my own personal budget constraint, given the fact that I'm getting taxed in the first period and I'm getting something in the second period, means I'm going to be saving less. I may try to offset it a little bit. I will try to offset it a little bit, but in the end, I won't offset it for the economy as a whole, okay? Because what I'm getting in the second period of my life is not what I invested in the first. So the aggregate investment in the economy will be lower, and therefore the marginal product of capital will be higher at any wage that I may be paid in the first period. The curve shifts to the right. Okay? So we move down the factor price frontier from the first point, omega r, or r omega, to r prime omega prime. Okay, so that's kind of an unequivocal result. It's kind of bad. If you have a pay-as-you-go system, the introduction of that pay-as-you-go system will depress capital formation. Okay? Is that always a bad thing?
Not necessarily. Depends on if the economy is dynamically inefficient. Then it would be a good thing.
Okay, so the answer is it depends. It depends on where you started. If you started in an inefficient place where you were saving too much anyway, this is a good thing. You're going to make the economy better off by reducing aggregate savings and reducing the aggregate capital stock. Okay, so to be honest, you have to tell the honest story. There are two answers. The other answer is it makes the economy worse off because we were already not saving enough. We're saving even less now because we're all kind of living off the Rente, but the Rente is nicht sicher. Or it's not as much as it would have been had I been investing in the capital market. Okay? So in the diamond model, this is often called the diamond model, not because it's diamonds, diamond hand rocket. It's because Peter Diamond was the inventor of this OLG model. He took the Samuelson model and plugged capital in there, and he shows basically, or we can show that for normal agents, you're going to actually depress capital formation in all cases. That's an unambiguous answer, but the welfare effects depend on dynamic inefficiency or efficiency. Okay, so that's a really cool example. And this would be the case of where it's not so great, right? We raise interest rates. So a lot of times people say, oh, you're going to raise interest rates when you introduce this Social Security program. Every country has this now, and now we're moving away from it. So if anything, the message is that maybe the model's also right in the other direction. As we move, like in the Netherlands or in Sweden, towards a funded system, we actually have to invest more, so we're saving more, so the interest rate is going to the tendency of the interest rate will be to go down. Okay? So think about that. Any questions? So now I got your attention. This is great. Okay, so again, the world is not as perfect as this model, so the population growth rate is not a constant written in stone, and it can change. So a country might introduce a pay-as-you-go system when population growth is really booming, and then suddenly people getting richer start having fewer children, investing in the quality of their children instead of the quantity, and that would bring N down. That suddenly puts the system at risk because die Renten sind sicher, the pensions are certain or safe only if there are enough people in a pay-as-you-go system to keep on coming online to produce, right? If you don't have that, you're in trouble. So, you know, if population growth declines unexpectedly, if you have emigration, so if people leave the country, this is a lot of countries, Ukraine is not the only one that's suffering from mass emigration right now. Cuba, Venezuela, many other Latin American countries. This is not good for their pension system because the young productive people who would be supporting the currently old are no longer there. So this is a big issue. It's also a big issue in Japan, but the Japanese save like the Weltmeister, so they save a lot. right? So it's kind of you have to always look at each individual country individually, and then you've got technical progress can slow down. So we have this feeling that the rate of technical progress around the world is slowing down. The rate of really innovative innovations, growth has definitely, we're getting excited about TikTok and videos, but not about, curing cancer. We just haven't been able to do that. And until we can do that and have all the affiliated investment and innovation, we're not going to, maybe the environmental crisis will drive a whole wave of new inventions and lead to a new burst of technical progress, growth. Very interesting area of economic research. Okay, so you have the conclusion of this discussion. It'd probably be a good idea to have several pillars. So the Germans love to talk about pillars, right? Drei Säulen, the three-pillar model. So you have the central government sort of doing the hard work, the central pillar, and then you've got if you work for a company, you might have a private pension, or like a professor in America, you have a private pension, and then you have your own private savings under your pillow in the bank, or your own ETF. So those three pillars, and the government treats these differently in different countries. In Germany, private savings are not treated very well tax-wise, unless you're very wealthy and you can take your money abroad. The public system in Germany is pretty good, but it's not publicly funded. Many private businesses have very generous private pensions, but they can go bankrupt. They can actually, if you have a stock market crash, there might be a problem. So again, maybe having three pillars is not such a bad idea. You had a question?
Yeah, about that pay-as-you-go system, if it leads to a decline in capital stock, how is the waging system going to be affected?
Well, if you have less capital per capita in this neoclassical production function, you have less capital per worker, and the marginal product of labor will go down. So in a system where you're literally not investing enough, you won't be paying workers as much as they could be paid under a funded system. I mean, you need, put differently, you don't have enough factories to make the workers productive.
So they should somehow recompensate this problem in a way that, I don't know, the pay-as-you-go system still works?
Well, it still works almost by construction. It'll fund itself, but people may not be as happy as they could be. That's the way of thinking about it. Always use the benchmark as the planner's solution. So think about this. The disadvantages of the funded system means that you could have a stock market crash, and the stock market is amazingly resilient around the world. And this is an interesting fact, but you can have significant downturns where you're stuck, and if you try to liquidate your savings to pay for yourself in retirement, you may not have enough money, right? So a lot of Americans, U.S. Americans were in trouble in 2008-9 because they lost a lot of money, and if they could just hang on for a few years, the stock market recovered. It did recover, because over very long periods, the rate of return on the stock market is significantly positive in real terms. Fun fact. But you have to be able to wait. So a lot of Americans had to stay in the labor market and work for another 5 years, 4 years, okay? Not so great. We don't have that in this model. You can't adjust your labor supply, but you would want to do that and try to ride out the storm, and that can cause disutility. Who wants to work when they're 70? Maybe I do, but. And what assets should the government buy? So that's the other question. What should the government do? Should it buy the stock market? That's politically difficult because people are always like expecting some money. They want to get paid for this and that. They want to get the commission. You got this whole industry of people trying to. So some countries say we'll just buy government debt. Of course, you have to go in the market and buy that. You have people going. So it's an interesting question. Some people say just do it some other way. Good luck. Speaking of government debt, this model has something to say about that too, because one might critically think, well, government debt is really, we owe it to ourselves. We issue the debt and we have to pay it back, but how do we pay it back? Well, we could try to run away, but we can't do that usually. If we're a government, we have to pay it to somebody and get the money from somebody, so we have to tax it in the future. So that's kind of very similar discussion to the discussion of Social Security. Okay, I thought there was a question. You have a question?
About the fully funded system, when you said that nothing changes and it would be like if private investors invested their money, wouldn't that be the same as for the economy as a whole, but in a private system, the capital would just be concentrated with the wealthier people who invested their money?
In this economy, we don't have classes, right? So we only have young and old, and all the young are equally rich or poor, and the young and the old, they're identical. You could indeed have classes in this economy. So the OLG model is amenable to all those types of modifications. But like I told you last time, you have to specify how people can move from one class to another or not. And if they can't, I think the problem set will give you some insight into what happens in the solo model if only the capitalists can save and the workers have to consume all their income. So you get an idea from that. You can extend that analysis to the OLG model. Okay, let's talk about government debt real quick. Okay, every period the government taxes the people when they're young, because that's the only time you're actually working as a laborer, is when you're young. And when you're old, if they tax it when you're old, then they would be stealing it from you because you wouldn't get anything. So we'll take the easy one. The government taxes when you're young and then basically gives you a bond or pays for it by issuing a bond that you buy, and it promises a rate of interest. Okay? And it takes the output and either throws it into the ocean, wastes it, or just gives it to you, but it doesn't affect your behavior at all. The young people would buy this debt because they're looking for a savings vehicle. Until now, they've been using the capital stock to finance their future consumption or to provide for their future consumption by acquiring it. Now the government is stepping in and putting its elbow in and saying, look, I can offer you this bond and I will pay you in the future by taxing the next generation. Okay? Sounds familiar, right? And every period it does that, so it's like rolling over the debt. It just taxes the next young generation and pays off the old, and only the old will have debt because when they were young they bought it. Okay, so it sounds a little bit like the previous case with the Social Security system. In fact, it's very similar. You could think of it as a different type of obligation, but we're just going to call this debt now. We're going to call this national debt, one period national debt. And it has to compete with the private sector, so it's going to pay the rate of return on private debt because there's no risk. There's no reason to prefer the government riskless debt or less risky debt. It will just pay the rate of return on capital. So the government's competing with the private sector for savings now. Right? So this is an easy argument you could make for crowding out. The government is trying to squeeze out the private sector issuing by issuing debt. It would make maybe less demand arise for holding capital. And a lot of people say this. They say, we owe this to ourselves anyway, so what's the big deal? All right, so there are all sorts of interesting issues here. One is that the government doesn't ask the young generations in the future whether they want to do this or not. So the government's just basically ignoring them. They're just pushing this program, and then it just kind of it creates this snowball of liabilities that future young generations have to pay for. And there are all sorts of other things that we could talk about. There could be different interest rates. The government might actually somehow be able to convince people to buy the debt at a higher price or a lower interest rate. Okay, that would also be kind of, but people may not want to do that. Maybe they're forced to do it because the government imposes some system on them, like forcing them to save. But anyway, we can still look at the model, the effect of this in the OLG model, and see what happens. And the benchmark in this model is really interesting. In the case where the current generation is given some debt and the young generation is told, when you're old, we're going to tax you to pay for it. Okay, that's the benchmark case. So you get taxed, they make a transfer to you, and then you basically have to pay back the debt when you're old. So it sounds almost like just nonsense, right? And it is kind of nonsense because you're taking the money, you're getting it back, and you have to pay this debt. So what are you going to do? You're going to put the money in the debt. You're going to use the debt to save for your future tax liability. So a long time ago, David Ricardo thought about this. So this is not a new idea. But Robert Barrow, who's a very famous economist at Harvard, has extended this idea. You can show that an OLG model, basically the government, this is just some gobbledygook to stimulate your thought in real time. What matters is the government's debt coming due has to be paid for by GDP in the future. Okay, so you can think about a golden rule in a world where you have debt, and the young people don't pay the interest when they're old, but the young people, in the subsequent generations, pay it when they're young. Okay, so you can think about that as well. And you can look at interest rates, and you can see that they're quite different. So indeed, 10-year government debt is lower, has a lower yield than corporate debt issued by the private sector. So there is an issue of whether it's really equivalent or not. But David Ricardo, back in 1817, wrote this. He said, suppose the government issues some debt, takes the proceeds from the debt issue and just spends it on something. Suppose it doesn't even spend it, just puts it in the bank. And then it tells the private sector, we're going to raise taxes next year, and you will have to pay these taxes. So the private sector, thinking intelligently, would say, well, I'm going to take this debt. The government's going to pay me £1,000 plus the interest rate in the next year. I'm just going to put this on the shelf, and when it comes due, I'm just going to say, hey government, pay me my money and my interest, and I'll use that to pay the tax that you're going to have to make me pay anyway. Okay, so it's an incredibly smart idea because it just says that the private sector can see through the veil of this government budget constraint. Okay, it's just an idea. We could look at it in our model because issuing debt with a promise to repay in the future based on the ability of future young generations to pay is the same kind of idea. Okay, but in the extreme case, Ricardo argued that the private sector would use the, knowing well and good that it would have to pay these higher prices in the future, would basically use the debt as a way of saving to pay it off in the future. Okay, so I put that there in emphasis so you can just read it. It's really interesting. This idea was around a long time ago. So this is called Ricardian equivalence, and sometimes it's called Barrow-Ricardian equivalence. You can think about it in the case of those curves. You know, if the private sector completely internalizes the future obligations, it would not have an effect on capital formation, but in general it will. So in general, it'll act like that pension system that was unfunded that we talked about before. It will cause people to save less because the increased debt will give them an alternative vehicle, and they will hold that debt, and therefore there'll be less capital formation and less and higher interest rates in the future. So that's the logic of debt, interest rates, national debt, interest rates. Okay? Now, there's an argument against that, which is, what if I have children? So Barrow argued, well, if I have children, it's not in the OLG model. So how do I put it in there? And what would I do if I cared about my children like I care about myself? So Barrow's contribution was to unravel the critique of the OLG model, that it would crowd out private savings and private investment. So I'm going to take a little excursion here to tell you about this very interesting person, Frank Ramsey, one of my heroes. Okay, he died much too young. He was like your age, basically, complete genius, mathematician, philosopher, and he thought economics was kind of interesting, but it was a side dish for him. It wasn't really his main forte. He wrote 4 papers in economics, and all of them were bestsellers back in the 1920s. So it's pretty cool. And he was the top gun in the mathematics tripods of 1923. if that means anything to you. That's kind of a big deal in the UK. So when he died of jaundice. Apparently he was hiking and he got hurt and didn't take care of himself. If you took my macro course, you'll remember Ramsey taxation. It's part of his legacy. We'll talk about the Ramsey rule in this course, or the Ramsey model. And actually he wrote two papers in economics, and the other two I think were in philosophy. So this is Keynes. This is the obituary from the, I think it's from the Economic Journal, but it's not written by Keynes. Keynes actually wrote the following. I mean, Keynes said, and this is Keynes, who was a pretty smart guy. So he was saying, when Ramsey came down from his stony heights, he lived without effort in a rarer atmosphere than most economists care to breathe. So it's quite a compliment from him. And he's left behind two witnesses to his powerful mental apparatus. His papers on a contribution to the theory of taxation, which is the idea of smoothing taxes over different types of sources. And the mathematical theory of saving is what I'm going to talk to you about right now. Okay. The latter, he says, is one of the most remarkable contributions to mathematical economics ever made. So it's kind of, Ramsey basically had this OLG model in his head, but he wasn't using OLG. He was thinking about the central planner, thinking about all future generations into infinity and saying, what is the right way of discounting their utility? What is the just way of treating future generations? Okay? And this notion of treating future generations is really a present, it's an issue in the present because of the climate crisis, right? How do you care about people who aren't born yet? We should treat them with a lot of respect because they're going to have to deal with the mess that we're giving them. And there are no unconnected individuals. And of course you can say, what about immigrants? You know, everyone's kind of connected somehow, but if you're coming from, like me, from another country, how do you fit into this, right? Well, if we have offspring, obviously they will fit in. And people like Amartya Sen, the famous Indian philosopher and economist and philosopher Nick Stern, have all argued that we should set this social planner's discount rate as closely as possible to zero because it's all about treating people equally and justly. So this is a deep moral question that Ramsey talked about in 1988. We're going to try to use the OLG model to motivate this, just indirectly, because in the OLG model, everyone's very selfish, right? They only have a 2-period horizon. Okay, so how would you do that? Well, Robert Barrow in the 1970s had this idea, which is still alive and kicking, but now the idea is simply the following. You're an agent, you're born today, you have 3 things you can do. One is you can consume when you're young, you can consume when you're old, and you have offspring, and this offspring has utility. And you can somehow affect it. You can affect it by giving that offspring some resources. You can give that offspring some of your capital stock. And you get utility from that because this V is a very similar function to the V in the period T. Okay, so that's the idea in a very abstract way. So now you have three possible instruments. You can choose your consumption today, consumption tomorrow, and you can choose a bequest to give your children when you leave the stage. Okay? So we're going to use the theta now as a discount rate by the private agent because we're going to go back into we're going to show this actually maps into the theta of the previous discussion. So now the budget constraint is a little bit more complicated. B is bequest. Okay, so when I'm young, I get the wage and I get the bequest from my dad or my mom or somebody, and that's what I can use to eat or save. And if I save, we'll have some resources for tomorrow. And if you plug that back into the resource constraint, you get exactly omega plus the bequest minus my consumption when I was young. Okay, so now you see, why would I give my future generations some B? Well, there must be some utility that comes from VT plus 1. And I've left it unspecified just to make you may be interested in looking at it a bit longer, BT plus 1, I'm choosing the money that my next generation is going to start with is a decision variable. So I can affect my own utility by choosing BT plus 1 appropriately or not appropriately. I can affect it. Okay, so we can take this model and just recursively substitute. If I have the same utility that my children have, and I can believe this, I don't know what my children really believe, but if they do, I can recursively substitute, and I can get something that looks like this. You know, if I go back, and I think of VT and VT plus 1 are just time-shifted versions of the same thing, then basically I can recursively substitute, and if I do that long enough into infinity, I get an infinite sum of future utility. Now, I can't control what my children do, and I can't control what their children do, but I can give them the Startkapital, I can give them some resources to enable them to do something with it. I want to make them at least as happy in some sense as I would see myself being if I were in their position. Okay? It looks like an infinite horizon version of the social planner's problem. So this is why in economics, henceforth, you will see a lot of this type of problem being put on the board. It's not like we really believe that people have this infinite horizon telescope, but it's just by recursion, by recursive thinking, it has to be like that. Okay? And the only way we can make it less like that is to raise our rate of impatience. Right? And again, if you know anything about math, if you discount at a rate like 5%, things get irrelevant very quickly. The stuff that happens 5 or 10 years from now is not worth very much. All the action happens now, basically, in the next 5 to 10 years. This impatience is also part of the problem, because if you don't think about the environment, you're not thinking about the next 30 years, you're thinking about the next 5 years. So that's why the theta is important. So ultimately, we really want to have a theta that gives some respect and concern about future generations. Okay, this model is nothing but an extended version of the turnpike model I put up on the screen an hour and a half ago. But now I can influence it by choosing bequests. Right? So that's what I'm going to try to show you. I'm going to try to motivate. So the way economists do this is they write the problem as a recursive problem. It's no longer infinite horizon. It's basically saying that I'm going to maximize the value of utility that I can get given the bequest I got from my parents. And that consists of 3 pieces. The first piece is my utility of consumption when young, and the second is the discounted utility of consumption when I'm old, and the third part is the discounted value of the happiness of my child or my child's generation. Okay? And it's optimized. So I'm assuming that VT plus 1 is actually coming from the same problem as the one I'm solving. So I'm assuming that my children are doing the best they can, and they look like me. In fact, they are me in some discounted sense. I mean, they are kind of me. That puts a lot of discipline on this problem. Okay, so I know if I give my child a little bit of B, T plus 1, because I'm choosing BT plus 1 in this maximization problem, I can influence that child's welfare. This V function is a positive function of the bequest that the child gets. That's a robust answer. And of course, I'm happier because it's a relaxation of my budget constraint if my parents gave me some money, right? So it's like a house of mirrors, you know. You put it in there and you know that your children are going to be happier and the children are going to be happier because their children are going to be happier and you know they're doing the same thing you are. So you have this incredible magnification effect. This is an old idea that has some bizarre implications, but this is kind of pretty much common sense, right? It's a fact in the United States that 40% of bequests are accidental. What do you think an accidental bequest is?
They say for retirement, but I die earlier than I expected.
If you croak early. If you die before you're supposed to. And you might say, well, that's obvious. People don't know when it's going to happen, so you're going to have some cash around. Yeah, right. And if you put risk in a model, you'll want to do that. But even if you don't have risk, it's a, the world has a certain amount of deterministic, we call it the life expectancy tables, right? We kind of know these things abstractly, okay? So you can actually think about what each generation is likely to fork over. It just turns out a lot of people are giving a lot too much to their children. So it can't be an accident. I think it's intentional. And fortunately, money is fungible. So you can use a little bit of for both. Yeah? Save for yourself, save for the kids, and possibly save to make your kids come visit you if they don't visit you enough. I didn't say that. Okay, so the most important aspect of this V function is, and we can derive it, is it has a positive first derivative. It's a function of the bequest I get. There's no other state variable in this model. But I just get some, remember, when you're young, you have to work to build up your capital stock. In the original model, you had no other income. Now you're getting some cash from your folks, from the older folks. Given that, any additional money you get makes you happier. So the first derivative of that function, yet undetermined, is positive. It's going to look like the utility function because it gives you the ability to eat more in the first period or in the second period or give more money to your children. Okay? Any questions about that? So maybe some of you took micro in your life, previous life. Maybe you're taking it right now. This is a little bit like an indirect utility function. Do you remember the indirect utility function from micro? Normally, when you're a household, you're choosing how many oranges and apples to eat, and you have some money, and you want to maximize your utility. You could write your maximized utility as a function of the price vector and your income without even knowing how much you're consuming, because you're doing the right thing, you're maximizing. This is called the indirect utility function. This is like that. B is the argument, is your income at the get-go when you start. Okay, I'm sure many of you just don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but think about it. So Ramsey, Ramsey's idea of being generous to future generations is kind of reasonable if you think that the agent will, given the chance, would use the bequest as a way of making herself happier or himself happier by giving it to the future generations that she cares about. Okay, so the optimized, if you want to use a star, if we think our future selves, our children, are going to behave like we do, then we have the same V function. That's the first discipline on this argument, on this whole logic, is that the V function of today is the same V function my kids will have. That's a slight intellectual step. I'm actually assuming that we're all kind of replications of ourselves, right? And if you do that, you can actually execute the maximization, an infinite horizon problem, in 2 periods. And that's called the value function approach to macroeconomics. It's kind of if you're interested in this and take more courses, you'll see this many times. In a sense, we've killed the infinite sum, because we're basically assuming that what comes in the second period is basically an optimized function of someone taking that decision in the next period. Therefore, the only way I can change utility for me is to affect BT plus 1. So I'm going to choose BT plus 1. Remember, that's one of my controls. Look at the problem. I'm choosing CT, C1T, C2T plus 1, and BT plus 1. I can't choose my own bequest. That was given to me, but I can choose the one I give to my kids. Okay, then the problem looks a little bit like what we had before. The only thing we have to worry about is, what about this theta? The weight we put on the future utility of ourselves. Okay? And before we had beta, and beta the minus 1 power minus 1 is the same thing as theta in principle, but they don't have to be equal. So our friend, the social planner, might have a different impatience than me as a family. But if they are equal, you get a very, very powerful equivalence result, that this dynastic utility maximizing household head will actually do the right thing. Okay, and I already said this about microeconomics, so you can just ignore it. The only problem is if you want to, it's a problem if you want to take away money from your children. It's easy to give your children money, but it's harder to take it. That would be a negative bequest. So you could go into debt, and in some countries, the children inherit the debt of their parents. Not good, not nice. So you can't do that. I think you can avoid it. In Germany, you can walk away from the debt of your parents. If you accept the inheritance, you have to accept the debt. Okay? I think it's the same in the US. I'm not quite sure anymore. But anyway, for positive values of B, you can replicate the social planner's problem if the social planner is equally impatient as the family planning the dynasty. Okay? Isn't that a cool result? I think it's fantastic, okay? You know, you can use an intuitive proof just to remember what we said before. You know, if they all behave the same way, the V function is a V star, and then you can take the derivatives of this function and get first order conditions that look like what we had before. Except the only thing that's different now is I get to choose B as well as S. And it's BT plus 1. You're not choosing your own inheritance, your own bequest, because you're bequeathing to your next generation. You choose BT plus 1. Okay? And remember, the nice thing about optimization is that by construction, you can't do any better than that. And it turns out you can eliminate this V star function. You can actually eliminate it from the problem. You can solve it out, because the first derivative of this V star function is like the marginal utility of wealth at the optimum. So if you do that, you can remove it, and you end up getting the first order condition that we had in the first problem, in the private problem. Okay, so if you do the substitution, you can look at the slides later, you get the last two equations, which are exactly the same as the social planner's optimum. So if you get people thinking like dynasties, you can actually get a social planner's outcome, or at least arbitrarily close, if people have the same impatience as the social planner. This is good news, and Robert Barrow wrote this in 1974, and for conservatives who like markets and market outcomes, this is like a dream world. This is like, I can use this, even though I don't understand it, I can use it as an argument that we should have free markets. So you have to be really careful. It's like a nuclear device. You don't want to just use it indiscriminately. But it is a powerful argument that if the more people think in dynastic terms, the closer they'll get to doing the right thing, not having excessive savings and not having especially not having inadequate savings, because that's the really important one. Intra and intergenerational optimality. Okay? Assuming that bequests are positive, or assuming that going into debt and giving the debt to your children is legal. Okay? So we're done. That was a lot of fun. Go home and study this stuff, and I hope to see you next week. Please come back. Bye.